been
like
more
to
punctual if I
I
thought
always
you would
like
just
to
lie too.
double check before I hit
Yeah.
record. Thank you so much for joining. This is a huge, I think, a huge privilege. And you know that you're, as you see from the number of people who are joining, for people to hear from you. And I know that you are basically working the lines left and right, to talk about this current moment. So I just want to thank you for giving your time and coming on. Um,
Oh, hey, Asha, it's a pleasure. You're doing such wonderful stuff yourself, and I'm really happy to see you.
Awesome. So I don't know, I gave you a little bit of a background, but I am currently doing research on complicity, how it works across different contexts, and then also moral courage. And so I'm looking at these dynamics in a number of different contexts, but what I wanted to do is use my Substack as a forum to bring in people who have expertise in aspects of complicity and moral courage in different contexts to talk about this moment that we're in. Um, and so, I mean, this is obviously, part of what undergirds all of your work. Um, and I just wanted to first start with an essay that you wrote after January 6th in 2021, which, was really illuminating about some of these dynamics. And you talked about the gamers and the breakers.
Mhm.
And um, when I was looking at kind of what you've been talking about recently, you are actually still using those terms before the 2024 election. And I'm just wondering, is that how you're still kind of conceptualizing this whole circle that is now running our government? Um, do you want to explain what you mean by gamers and breakers, or are we looking at just a completely um, I don't know. I would just be interested in how you would describe the current structure, infrastructure
Okay.
of what, you know, of this onslaught, from all directions. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm just curious to how you're perceiving our
Yeah.
government right
Yeah. So I'll start with the way you asked the question with the gamers and the breakers, and then I'll take a couple steps towards what I think is going on right now, and then we can continue. So, for those of you who didn't read that essay, that was something that I was writing before January 6th, and then it got published right after January 6th. But I was pretty sure something like January 6th was going to happen, and so we were able to get it out sort of as an analysis. And I appreciate your remembering this because that was an important thing, and I'm glad that I was able to do that. The gamer and breaker analysis was about the Republican Party. The notion was that there are people working in a patient way, the gamers who understand that by way of dark money and gerrymandering and voter suppression, they are eventually going to win. And therefore, they don't really need drama. They don't need a January 6th. They don't need insurrections. They don't even need anything which draws attention to what they're doing because they've got the thing gamed out. Right. And that's one Republican strategy. And frankly, it was largely working, at least at the federal level. And then by breakers, I meant people like Trump, and like those who joined him openly around January 6th, people who are willing to actually just throw it all away, start again. And so I think that distinction's still relevant, but we've got a lot. Basically, the breakers are in charge now, and the gamers have been consigned to a minority of House Republicans, a minority of House senators, sorry, a minority of senators, but also not irrelevantly, some state level politicians. So, I mean, maybe we'll get to this later, but I'm just going to mention it now. In Ohio right now, you have what looks like a very big ICE operation coming to the town of Springfield, which happens to have about 10 or 15,000 Haitians. If this comes down the way that I'm afraid it's going to come down, these Haitians are losing their temporary protected status tomorrow at midnight. That's going to be something that the federal government is doing, which will be very dramatic. There'll be a lot of federal power and applied to people who are, in American terms, black. There will be a racial component behind it because Vance stigmatized these people very drastically during the presidential campaign. And also, these people were stigmatized in a very clear and dramatic way by actual Nazis who visited Springfield, Ohio, and helped Vance to bring this question to national attention. That's a breaker operation, storming into a red state, deporting thousands of people who are economically productive. And then you can look at people like Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio, who will not say that he's against this because he will just say the law is the law, but who is clearly is against it, clearly thinks that these people are working productively. And we, the Republicans, can dominate Ohio as they do without this kind of thing. Right, we can continue. Ohio, as I think, maybe the most gerrymandered state. It's gerrymandered to some kind of wild flaming hell. I mean, it's just ridiculously gerrymandered. So, like from a gamer point of view, you don't need this stuff. You know, you're running the show anyway, and you'll be running the show for the indefinite future. But I mean, to use these terms, the way things have changed is roughly that the breakers are in charge. And the breakers now have the joiners, right? They have the people who like the breaking, who are a minority, but who are an empowered minority, empowered by their masks when they join ICE, empowered by the emotion that they feel when they see other people suffer. And but the most important joiners are the people who are like the oligarchs who are behind the scenes. And I'll just stop here because it's a big idea, but the oligarchs behind the scenes for whom chaos is very desirable because it helps them because they see breaking the US as the first step towards some kind of transformation, towards creating something else.
Yeah, I want to come back to the oligarchs. But let's stay with the breakers for a second and the fact that people are staying silent, even when they disagree or, even when they're not on board with it. Um, so let me ask you this question. Because, you're a historian, there are a lot of comparisons made between our moment and previous moments in history. Then people say, no, you can't make that comparison. You know, I when Kilmar Abrego Garcia was disappeared, I'm a Latin American studies person. I analogize it to 1973 Chile. What do you think is the historical paradigm slash model that we are kind of in parallel with? Is it a Frankenstein combination of a lot of things? Is the Gestapo Nazi analogy, is that appropriate? Is it something else? I'm curious where you see this on kind of the spectrum of insanity that we've had historically.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to make a super boring methodological point now, and everybody can tune out for the next 30 seconds if they want. But like, if you're a historian, there's the history you know, and there's there's the taboos on history, which are like a sociological fact, and then there's the relevance of history, and there's some, those three things are always in some kind of they're always interacting with each other, right? So there's a lot of history that's relevant to what's going on right now. I mean, I would say the Fugitive Slave Act, and I'm not the first to say it. Obviously, a lot of people made this point, but like there's American history, which is obviously most relevant, right? Um, and then there's European history, which I know much better, which I think is also quite relevant. So, for example, ICE for me, it's helpful for me to understand ICE in terms of Germany in the 30s, because one of the problems that the Nazis had in the 30s was how to build a national police force which is loyal to one man at the center. And they came up with a solution to that, starting from a federal situation like we have. And ICE for us is a solution to that. And so if you recognize that creating a centralized police force which is loyal to one man in the center is part of a regime change, then you're I think that helps you to see the U.S. What there's taboos to talking about on is kind of arbitrary, right? And for me, I think that like that we just have to kind of nudge aside because I, basically saying that you can't talk about this or that form of history is a way of saying that it doesn't matter, right? And so, like, just to take it to the extreme example of the Holocaust, which is something that I worked on for 15 years. When people say the Holocaust is unique, what they're in fact saying is that it's irrelevant because you can't use it to interpret anything else. And then and that means that never again means never this precise thing again. And of course, like that precise thing is never going to happen again. And so we don't actually have to do anything to prevent, Germans from killing Jews in Ukraine in 1941. That precise thing is indeed never going to happen again. But other things that are in some way related or similar could happen again, and they're more likely to happen again if it's only the fascists who are using the history, which is which is where you end up, right? Because to make a slightly different point, it's quite obvious that people in the White House are using this history in a different way. The history that I'm familiar with, they're using it a different way. And the history that you're referring to, like the history of our relations with Latin America, they are also using that history. I mean, if we don't know about the history of the US intervening in Latin America and changing rulers, it's much harder to figure out what could be going on with Maduro. So, I mean, my view is that every historian should bring the thing that she or he has, and that we shouldn't say that it's the same. We should say, here's a pattern that I know something about, which might help you to see a pattern which is unfolding right now.
Thank you for that. So to look at kind of these people that I'd mentioned before who are staying silent. I mean, one of the things when you look at the post-World War II adjudication of guilt of all the people that were involved, you had, the people who committed war crimes were tried at Nuremberg. You had some core group of, there was sort of this gradation of complicity, that they adjudicated people on. And the people who were like really driving the violence, was relatively small, really compared to the people that were just supporting it and kind of going along with it, like the kind of the lesser offenders or whatever that they called them. Why? Like, in other words, what is the dynamic that is driving these people, the people that are like the Governor DeWines, the people in Congress who could, I mean, because it's like what, like 12 people now who could stand up. Is it 12, 23? I forget who it is. But some relatively small number of people who could really put an end to so much of this.
Mhm.
Because what is happening is largely authority that has been delegated by Congress, right? So it could theoretically claw it back. Um, is it, I mean, when people just say, oh, they're afraid of not getting, is it really just the fear of that? Or it's hard for me to see that the gamers at this stage possibly see any instrumental transactional value. Because I mean, it seems like in a breaker world, they're also going to be eliminated at some point in some way or form.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, uh, they have been. I mean, since I wrote the piece that you kindly remembered at the beginning, a lot of the people who are gamers have in fact been eliminated in the sense that they've been primaried or they've decided not to run again. And sometimes those people have then actually said interesting, courageous things afterwards. But in general, there is an element of fear with Trump in particular. And I mean, the interesting thing about Trump and fear is that it's the people in his own party who fear him the most. And that's led to the transformation of his party, where he's been able to intimidate the people who are politically closest to him much better than he's been able to intimidate anyone else. And so the Republican Party in this relatively short period of time has sorted itself out in such a way that the gamers have tended to go away. So part of it is that the numerical balance has changed, and that does have a little bit to do with fear. But you can also call fear lack of courage, right? I mean, so we don't want to treat fear as just some kind of neutral, physical phenomenon which no one can resist and is just there. It's meaningful that people drop out of politics because they are, afraid to some extent. Because if you drop out of politics when you're afraid to some extent, that creates a pretty smooth pathway for one person who frightens you a little bit to have total power. So I want to note that morally, and this is like the second thing I wanted to say. I think a lot of people really don't like courage. I mean, I think a lot of people don't like it. I think they don't like being courageous. I think they, I mean, you see this in like I mean, just staying close to Springfield now. Springfield, Ohio is on my mind because that's where I'm from, and this like terrible thing is about to come crash. I'm not from Springfield, I'm from that area of Ohio, and this terrible thing is about to come crashing down. But like when I look at what the Ohio senators are saying, it's just comfortable for them to